is willing to read our passage?
I can do it.
All right. Thanks, Jeff.
Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us." This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." The third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished. Excuse me.
All right. Thanks so much, Jim. So just to sort of remind us, thank you again also for joining us. This is our 21st session, and we'll have one more next week, which I think will bring everything to a conclusion. And then we head off into Memorial Day and summer, and hopefully good things for all of us in that regard. We have traveled through Luke and made it all the way up into the very, very end. Essentially, this is the passion narrative that we're in. And we're up into the crucifixion scene itself. The passion narrative, in some sense, starts with the Last Supper. It moves into the scene in Gethsemane, even though Luke doesn't necessarily use that language. The arrest of Jesus. And then we have a series of trial scenes in Luke. As I mentioned last week, there are 4 scenes that Luke preserves for us. And he tends to, if we compare, just to remind you again, if we compare Luke's account to the other synoptic gospels, and especially to the Gospel of John, he really pares down these scenes in a way that sort of is obvious as you read through some of the things that he decides not to include. The one thing that he does include is he includes a trial scene in front of Herod, and that really is the scene that has just preceded the one that marks our section. So Jesus has just been sent off to Herod. And the collusion of Herod and Pilate has led to a forming of a bond. We talked through the social and political meaning of what it meant in verse 12 to say that Pilate and Herod had become friends. And we also talked about the way that resonates with Psalm 2. And the psalmist there says, "The kings of the earth conspire together against Yahweh and his anointed." And so in a sense, like, there's a very material example of precisely that. So now we turn to what is effectively our final trial scene, which is happening in these verses 13 through 25. And just as a kind of overview comment, and I think it's pretty straightforward in a sense, that you see an interaction between Pilate and particularly the religious authorities. I'll come back to some additional wrinkles that are in there, but it's their back and forth, which I think it'd be fair to say leads to basically a breakdown of justice, one that is kind of on display, because Pilate renders a second time a verdict that would have meant that Jesus was, of course, not guilty. and innocent. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. The one sort of theological element that I want to also highlight here, which I think is important because of the way that all of the gospel authors, not just Luke, but Matthew, Mark, and John included, all of them think about Jesus's passion in apocalyptic characters, or in a kind of an apocalyptic register, essentially. That what Jesus is undergoing, what is being done to him, is something akin to the final judgment that folks who would have held to some sort of an apocalyptic vision would have thought about. And in that kind of context, a key figure, one that we've already heard about, and that we will in fact hear one more echo at least of, is the figure of the Son of Man. And so if you remember, apocalyptic is a genre and a kind of way of thinking about the end, rooted in Daniel chapter 7, and then offering additional expansions in other texts, particularly texts that are not necessarily in the canon, but that probably played a significant role or had a significant influence on the Jesus movement, on Jesus himself, certainly on Paul and others, where they talk about the Son of Man. Well, what is the Son of Man? Like, when does he appear? He appears at the end, and he appears in a sense in the context of judgment. And if you read Daniel chapter 7, it is God's judgment of the nations. And so, and I think, one of the sort of paradoxical or reversals or upside down elements of the way that the gospel stories are told, the way things that sort of unfold, is that rather than the Son of Man essentially rendering judgment, he undergoes judgment. And I think this is particularly the case here, where we can say something like, here we have the Son of Man who was meant to execute judgment, turned over to Gentiles to suffer an unjust judgment. And that is certainly here in Luke. It's very strikingly on display in John. And you can also find other places in Mark and Matthew that resonate with that. All right, so let's turn into the text. We'll start then with verse 13, and just a couple comments. Really just kind of one main comment on this. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people. And so, the idea is basically at the end of verse 12, Jesus has now been sent back from Herod to Pilate. He's been mockingly dressed in a robe. So Herod, in doing this, is essentially signing off on playing along in this little charade. And remember, I think it's important to keep in mind that on a certain level, and I'm not saying that this is obviously the meaning of the whole by any stretch of the imagination, but on a certain level, the drama that unfolds with Jesus is unfortunately the drama that often unfolds with people who have very little political power. He is an innocent person who's essentially a pawn of people with more power. And I think that's the case when we look at Herod and Pilate and the chief priests and the game that they are playing with each other as it kind of unfolds. So upon his return, Pilate then calls together the leadership to sort of, what I think it'd be fair to say at this point, at least, kind of put this thing to rest because of the verdict he's about to give. One of the interesting wrinkles, though, here is it's not just that Pilate calls together the chief priests and the leaders, but also the people. And if you remember, one of the points I've tried to make over the last 2 weeks, I think at least, a central concern for Luke in terms of the way that he tells the story of Jesus's execution is to make it clear that the motor, the sort of center of agency for putting Jesus to death, rests primarily with the religious elite in collusion with Pilate. And that in some ways, if we went back sort of and we kind of read through chapters 20 to, I guess it's about 22, we get a picture of a city that is Jerusalem that's essentially divided in regards to Jesus. The religious elite, the leaders, the chief priests, etc., they certainly oppose Jesus, and want to get rid of him, essentially. The people, on the other hand, are enamored with Jesus. They're delighted. There's a couple of places where it talks about that they're delighted in the words that he says, etc. So there's a kind of line, I think it'd be fair to say, that's established by Luke, but it's really here. And as we move into in a few minutes, the rest of this story, as Jesus heads towards crucifixion, that line becomes blurred. And Luke doesn't really offer to us an explanation precisely as to why this happens, exactly how it happens. I think we're on pretty solid ground. There's been a lot of certainly work on this around mob mentality, crowd mentality, as one way of explaining how it is that the people turned essentially against Jesus. One of the probably more compelling arguments that I heard among the commentators that I read, primarily having to do with Luke's portrayal, is once you sort of put the stink of sedition on Jesus, which is what most of the, I think it'd be fair to say in Luke's gospel, that seems to me to be the primary kind of accusation against him that sort of sticks with him all the way through. Even Pilate here, talks about perverting the people. That's a sedition element. It's not the claim of being Messiah, etc. It's the sedition. Well, once you put that stink on him, then maybe the people fearing Rome, they don't necessarily want to be associated with that. Again, we don't really know. All right. And I think importantly, and I think John, I think you might want to mute because I hear an airplane.
Sorry.
Okay, flying from Flying Cloud Airport over you. I know you're like about 1.5 miles from me, so I know that's probably what it is. When we get up into Acts, and so this is what the reference to Acts chapter 3, verse 17, and I think there's a second reference too, where the apostles say, we know that you and the leadership put Jesus to death, but that you did so out of ignorance. So we want to keep that in mind in the background, I suppose, as we think about who's really involved in this, etc. Then we get verses 14 and 15. All right. So this is essentially Pilate rendering his verdict. I'm going to come back to 16 in a second because it's obviously included here, but it represents a really troubling turn, if you will, in terms of the way that Pilate is thinking about this. So, and he said to them, you brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. And here I've examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. So this is essentially the final verdict. It's the second time that Pilate has declared Jesus innocent. He now enfolds what wasn't really reported to us, but obviously, was the verdict rendered from Herod, which is that Jesus is innocent. He is not deserving of death. And I think, it's interesting here, if you think about Roman law in a procedural sense, it's actually correctly discerned or diagnosed Jesus' situation, right? He is innocent, effectively, of all the charges that have been brought against him from the leadership, and certainly from Rome's perspective. Now, what's troubling in that regard is what Pilate says in verse 16. He says, I will therefore have him flogged and release him. Now, notwithstanding the reality that prefects and other folks who were in charge of certain regions under Roman control had a lot of leeway and latitude for how they treated their subjects. To flog an innocent man is, I really think, is pretty much beyond the pale of what we might call a just decision, because flogging was was something that actually I think I read in one of the commentators or somewhere in my research, not connected necessarily to our section, but maybe to something else I was working on, that flogging led to fatality in at least 50% of the cases. Like, you were beaten pretty severely. And of course, depending, and I'm sure we've heard about the cat of nine tails and those kinds of stories. And I don't even, who knows for certain if that's what's being used here. But it was as I mentioned here, kind of physical catastrophe that typically killed anyone, or at least 50% of the people who underwent it. So to declare Jesus innocent and then to decide that you're going to flog him, the only real explanation that one could come up with, which I think then sets up what happens in the next few verses, is that Pilate wants to make I guess, teach a lesson or make an example out of Jesus for even being accused of something like sedition. And so, as I mentioned here, it makes clear that Pilate is not necessarily concerned about innocence or justice. He's concerned rather about law and order. And sedition, right, essentially is was one of the great terrors that the Romans faced. And certainly someone who was in Pilate's situation would have been concerned about that. So flogging him is I think, certainly not justified. So we have that as a setup, and then we move forward. The first thing is just to call to attention the fact that there's no verse 17. So probably, if you have your Bible out, or maybe you have your Bible app, you'll see that verse 17 is not typically included in most of the modern translations. The reason for this is that there is a significant number, I think it's like a majority of early manuscripts, that don't include the sentence that's offered here. And that sentence is basically something to the effect that Pilate was obliged to release a prisoner during Passover. And so that's the verse that's basically missing. Obviously, that verse shows up and is accounted for in other gospels. So we do have that as a kind of element of the story. There is, though, the reality, which is that there's really not much evidence outside of the New Testament witness to substantiate whether or not this is the case or not. So but anyway, that's why it's not there. And so I don't know if we need to dwell on it any more than simply to note that it's not. I mean, if there's a verse that's missing, I should at least say something about why it's probably not there. All right, so then turning to 18 to 19, or 18 and moving beyond, where we see basically the complete breakdown of justice, which has sort of been teetering and now kind of collapses. We start in verse 18 and into 19. Then they all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow, release Barabbas for us." This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Now, there's a couple of things that we want to say. One is I just want to say, sort of in an overarching sense, from 18 up to 25, there is this kind of back and forth between Pilate and the authorities and the people, right? And that really is kind of the dynamic that's at play here, which you can kind of see if you read. And the second thing to note is that there is a kind of almost total and complete rejection of Pilate's verdict here. And it's worth noting in that regard, right? That it's not just that Jesus is rejected, it's that he's fundamentally and fully rejected. And I'll talk in a few minutes about the nature of crucifixion, which makes that point even sharper. excuse me, I've been having these issues with my throat today where it's a little tickle, and I don't know if it's probably
Allergies.
allergies, exactly. I'm sorry. Give me a second.
The pollen counts are very, very high.
Are they really? Okay, that explains it. This happened to me today when I was teaching as well. Maybe I thought maybe God just wanted me to shut up. All right. So what happens? They ask for a fellow that we really don't know, but it's very interesting. We get a name, and then we get a character description. And I think those two things are they carry a certain kind of theological or symbolic weight. So Barabbas. So Barabbas, that name literally means son of the Father. And there've been, so there's been several reflections that are taken out of this, that this is a moment where the crowd, where the leadership, etc., shows that it has improperly discerned, right? Here is quote unquote the Son of God, and they choose this other fellow. They have not properly discerned what it means to be a son of the Father. Right? They failed to truly discern that. And I think it really should be underlined. Barabbas's character. They are choosing someone whose life is shaped by insurrection and murder over against someone whose life is shaped by trying to liberate and heal and restore people, right? So this is a choice not just between two personalities. It's literally almost like a choice between two different ways of life, two different ways of living. And certainly they are embodied in these two different persons. So this is not just Jesus' person, it's a kind of rejection of his way of life. So as we think about this idea of the rejection, of the fundamental repudiation, I mean, part of what the crucifixion scene and the whole crucifixion story tells us about ourselves is the deep, deep resistance that we all have for God's call on our life, for what God wants, how God wants us to live out our life. So to reject Jesus, in a sense, is precisely to reject that way of life that Jesus embodied. And of course, there are a number of other things also that I think we would also want to unfold in that. But in this particular case, that's important to note. So verses 20 to 23, then, we get the back and forth, right? Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. Now, I don't really have a comment here, at least on the screen, but I do want to note that this is the third time that Pilate has said Jesus is basically innocent. Now, obviously, that's complicated because even though he's innocent, he still wants to flog him. But for the third time, and so the number 3 is typically a number of completion. So, and this was also from a literary perspective, one of the things I think I mentioned about Luke. Well, I guess I'll mention this in a moment, but from a literary perspective, Luke is particularly fond of sets of 3. And so there are these 3 different times that Pilate is engaged. Okay, we get the back and forth. We get the attempt again by Pilate to release Jesus. We get the pushback, and now it's pretty clear, it's the crowd as a whole, right? So that line has kind of been thoroughly blurred. And starting in verse 24, it collapses. All right, the possibility of justice collapses. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for. And again, Luke states it again. This is why I think this is important. the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder. That's what they're choosing. And he handed Jesus over as they wished. So I have kind of 2 points here, that I think are worth noting. One is that this is the moment of breakdown. And it's, I think my first line here is an attempt to read the scene as stated, even though it's not stated directly, which is, it seems to me the only real possible explanation is that Pilate wants to avoid the possibility of a violent insurrection at that moment, right? The crowd is becoming so heated. We've already talked about, that the tempers flare during Passover, etc. So his concern for law and order, in other words, prevails over his concern about justice. The second thing, though, and this has been especially powerful, and you may have heard this before in sermons or devotions or devotional literature or whatever, this description of Barabbas, right, as someone who is a lawbreaker and a murderer. This has been used in a way as a way of describing humankind in general. And I think there's even a movie. Is Quo Vadis? I can't remember if Quo Vadis is about this. I think Quo Vadis is about one of the centurions that witnesses Jesus's death. But I think there is a movie, though, that kind of centers Barabbas. And it's not just a story about Barabbas. It's sort of a story about Jesus taking the place of one who truly deserved death. Right. So this is one of those places where that comes and essentially is surfaced in the text and the telling of the story. All right, let me stop for a sec and see what kind of comments or questions or thoughts we have before we move into our next material.
I've always been struck by the fact that Pilate, all the power, all of the soldiers that were around, obviously, in this case, that he wouldn't have had the guts to call on them to overpower the people, but it just shows how weak he was and how fearful of his own life he was. But it always struck me that obviously there were many soldiers around that time, he could have done whatever he wanted.
Well, and Pilate, and I think that's a great point, Linda. I think about it from the perspective of, this is just another peasant. These people are going to lose their minds, and I might lose control of Jerusalem over some guy. Who cares?
Yeah.
That's to me, that's part of the and I will actually bring that out actually in the following scene, where here's an innocent person being crushed for no good reason other than Pilate doesn't want to have to deal with the headache of it, right? Or the possibility of sedition. And I think that's right.
If you track with the broader notion that we've talked about before and is often talked about, that the people, along with just about everybody else, don't understand what Jesus' kingship is or what his kingdom is. If you track with the notion that they're expecting a victorious battle king who will throw out the Romans and reestablish Jewish rule in Jerusalem and in Judea, their rejection of Jesus and claim for Barabbas as the alternative makes some more sense, because Jesus has clearly shown himself not to be attempting to incite full rebellion and get the people to rise up. And Barabbas, on the other hand, has been fighting the good fight, as it were. It's not stated, but presumably killing Romans or killing collaborationists and fighting against the occupation. So it is somewhat less
I think the Jim freeze up.
It looks like it.
I think his bandwidth is low.
Can you
Okay.
hear me?
We can hear you now.
Yeah. The leaders of the people are worried about bringing wrath over a fear rejecting the guy who isn't calling for, asking for the guy who has been fighting for it, even though their stated reason for worrying about Jesus, amongst other things, is that he's going to cost them their place by getting the Romans all worked up.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just drawing, I think, on John's gospel, which is where we get that sort of bald-faced explanation, right? It's better that one man
Yeah.
die than all die. I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point, actually, because one of the things at issue in the Gospel of Luke has been, what is the kingdom of God? What is the nature of that kingdom? And certainly Jesus's own kingship, his entry into the city, all that was sort of shaped by that. And even here, and I mean, he's right, he's going to be executed as a king, effectively. I think that's a great, right. There's a sort of, and frankly, if we look back at the Old Testament, right, Israel already has a king, Yahweh, but it wants other kings. It wants a king like the other nations. So it's almost like that same drama, like it keeps getting churned and returning. So I think that's a great point. Thanks so much for bringing that out, Joe. All right, let me maybe move us forward and let's see here. Can I get a volunteer who's willing to read our next passage?
I'll give it a go.
All right, thanks, Rick.
As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?"
Okay, all right, thank you so much. Oh, I'm not sure. I guess I did not turn on my little gadgets that help me click through. So you get to see all of it at once.
Yeah.
So let me kind of talk through it first. The first thing is, just as I mentioned here, that Luke does not give us an account of the flogging or of the crown of thorns. You find those in other places in Matthew, as I mentioned here. I think it's also probably in Mark as well. I didn't get a chance to kind of cross-check all that necessarily. But I think even though it's not included, the fact that Simon of Cyrene and the scene of Simon, who appears across all of the synoptics, indicates to us that Jesus is weak. And which was actually typical, not just of the Gospels or sort of this, kind of religious text, but other accounts of crucifixion that we have from the ancient world include either the person having to carry their beam or needing someone else to do so because they were too weak. Who is Simon? So Simon of Cyrene. So Cyrene is located in North Africa. It was a place with a significant Jewish population. So Simon is more than likely also Jewish. He might be dark-skinned. We don't really know. More than likely he was. Jesus himself is probably also dark-skinned. But the fact that his memory is retained suggests that he is a figure of some note. I think it's in Matthew or Mark. One of the two of them actually also preserve the sons of Simon of Cyrene, which also suggests that they might have been known more broadly as key figures in the life of the early church. So as a figure, this is someone who, is in terms of tradition and the life of the early Christian community was clearly important. The way in particular that Luke renders this story or this scene is that Simon literally takes up his cross and follows Jesus, right? Right. He lays the cross is laid on Simon and he carries it behind Jesus, which, may obviously be a description of what happened, but it is also clearly a kind of indication of what discipleship looks like. It looks like following after Jesus in the way that Jesus walked. And here is sort of a literal rendering of that. Whereas I think in other ways, we can kind of maybe find more metaphorical or improvisational ways to do that. The second thing that I have on here is to highlight the starting in verse 27, a great number of people followed him. And there really are two things that I want to point out. One is, again, we see the people, right? The people are a part of this journey. The people are also going to be present at the crucifixion, and we're going to hear about their response to it, which is quite unique in a way. And I'll talk about that as we get to that passage. The other thing, though, that I wanted to say is that this also is in keeping with what we know about crucifixion as a sentence. Crucifixion is not just a one-time singular thing. That is that, you take a person and you nail them to a tree and you hang them up. It has a much broader, it has a kind of process sense. So most crucifixions and the kind of process of being crucified included flogging or beating. It included public mockery. It included being stripped of your clothing. It was meant to be something that people watched. And as I mentioned here, it has an almost circus-like aspect to it. And part of the reason for that is that it was designed, crucifixion is designed to completely dehumanize the victim. The victim is, if you receive the sentence of crucifixion, you're not just going to be put to death. Your dignity as a human being is going to be stripped from you through the process of crucifixion. And so, going back to what I said before about the complete rejection of Jesus, this is what I mean. That Jesus, in other words, is not only considered to be a threat, he is a threat that cannot be disposed of by the law. He is a threat that must be disposed of by one of the most heinous forms of death devised. And that's essentially what crucifixion basically is. And I'll come back to that point later. So this idea, though, of a crowd traveling with Jesus, this is very much in keeping with what we know about it as a process that the Romans themselves used. The second thing to note, just before we sort of shift, I mentioned it, I guess, here in 27b to up to 31. So I'll just read this. And among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Now, this scene is unique to Luke, as I mentioned here in the outline. It's also among all of the Gospels, the only scene, and maybe the Gospel of John includes something, but again, I didn't get a chance to check. It's one of the very few scenes that we have of Jesus making his way to the cross. So this interchange and so that makes it kind of a very important and unique element. Now, who are the women? We don't know here. Eventually we're going to hear about the women who are with Jesus and who have been with Jesus all along the way. Here, that distinction is not made clear yet. And it's entirely possible that these women were professional mourners. We know that in the ancient world, particularly in Jewish culture, that you could hire people to come and mourn, and there were different kinds of reasons for that. In the context of crucifixion, because crucifixion was used typically against political enemies of the state, there's a lot of kind of good reason to hire someone else to express your grief. So if you had a son or a cousin or a brother or someone that you were connected to who had to undergo this horrific, horrible experience, and you showed emotion for that, you yourself could get caught up potentially in the dragnet. And so having someone else mourn on your behalf makes a lot of sense. So it's possible, again, and not necessarily definitive, but possible. As I mentioned, though, Jesus's interactions with them, and I kind of read it this way. Jesus here, I do think, is clearly talking about the eventual destruction of Jerusalem, which is going to happen, in 70, the temple's destroyed. And then in 130, I think it's 136 or so, the city itself is laid waste. Well, the stories of what happens there when the Romans assault the city, siege it, are pretty horrific. Eventually people are some people are subject to eating their children. There, at least that's according to some passages in Josephus. So that is, from my perspective, that is what Jesus means by when the wood is dry. So here's kind of the overarching point. If the people in charge will do this to an innocent person when things are pretty good, what do you think is going to happen when things are really bad to the innocent? They're going to be completely destroyed. They're going to be people that wish they didn't have children. They're going to be people who long for the mountains, to come and fall upon them. So that at least is the way, essentially, that I would read sort of historically the way that Jesus is talking here. A second element to this is, of course, the last line there, which is the sense of a ricochet, right? What is being doled out to Jesus now eventually will wind up kind of boomeranging on the city itself, and when that happens, woe to the innocent, because the innocent will not necessarily be able to avoid it. So let me stop there for a second and see if there are comments or questions before we move into our next scene. All right, I will move us forward then if there's no. I could have sworn I'd set these up so that they would make little awesome, funky transitions, but they don't. All right, can I get a volunteer who's willing to read then our next passage?
I can do it this time.
All right, great.
Go ahead. Thank you, Mary.
Others also who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanging there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He replied, truly, I tell you today, you'll be with me in paradise.
All right, thank you so much, Mary. Okay, so we now come to the crucifixion scene itself. Right, we've been in the Passion story, but of course the Passion includes more than just the crucifixion. And I think it's worth thinking about here, there's really two, huge mountaintop events, we might say, that shape, I certainly think the early Christian community, but I would suggest, it should still shape the Christian church. One is, of course, the resurrection of Jesus. And frankly, I don't think there's much of a Christianity without the resurrection of Jesus. The second, though, is the crucifixion. And I did deliberately, put them kind of rearrange the ordering here, in part because crucifixion only becomes a problem in some sense when someone comes back from the dead. It raises the question, why did this person have to die? Why do they have to go through this? And so the early church, the early gospels, they take a lot of time to give to us, to preserve for us certain memories and details. And then if you think about the author, they have to figure out how to arrange this material in a certain kind of way. So Luke I think all of that is preamble for me to say that Luke has a particular way that he's arranging the materials, the story that he tells here, that's unique to him, just like Matthew would have something unique. And they're all kind of interacting with each other, but there's still something unique. And in regards to Luke, it's what I mentioned before. It's the sets of three that we find with Luke. So we have three crosses. We have three different groups or groupings of people that are around the cross. We have three different sayings of Jesus. And then we have three different responses to Jesus. And so I think just as a literary document here, remember that what happened is even greater, of course, than the account. But of course, the account is our access essentially into that. The other thing, the second thing that I want to note, and it's actually, I got it listed here. I'm not sure why I listed it as a sub point, but I think maybe I did because, so on theological reflection of this scene, particularly with the three, the three crosses, there have been a number of theologians who have pointed to this and said, this is the first church on someone. Now, I think they utilize that, they take a little bit of liberty with that. But the point is, right, that you have, that the church is oftentimes a mixed reality, in which sometimes we respond in faith, and sometimes we do not respond in faith. And so just take that for what you will in terms of the history of the church. The last thing that I think is really important, just as a kind of broad statement, is to note that all of the gospel authors are not really interested in the gory details of crucifixion. Like, that's a Hollywood thing. That's a Mel Gibson drawing on the 18th century visions of a German mystic thing. And I think there's something important there theologically. So it's not the gory details of Jesus's death that's important. It's the same way if you go back into the book of Leviticus and you look at the Day of Atonement, it's the same thing. It's not interested in the gory details of the sacrifice of the animal. That's not ultimately the point. And I think, as I would say here, just as a way of kind of starting to think about that, the real interest of the gospel authors is in the life of Jesus and in Jesus's faithfulness unto death. That's what they're really interested in. And so as we describe what crucifixion is like, I think that brings in additional layering for us and helpfulness, but we don't want to get lost in that, to think that, oh, Jesus just got the crap beat out of him so that, we could all be free. And that's what the gospel message is about. I have a very hard time thinking that that's what the gospel ultimately means. I understand that for some people that is what it means, but I'm not sure that that's correct. All right, so let me kind of shift us into the scene, starting with 32 into 33. Two others also who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. So we've already heard, going back to a scene at the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, Jesus talks about kind of referencing basically the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, that he would be numbered among the outsiders, the lawless, the criminals, and now that has come to pass, right? Jesus is killed as a criminal. He dies as a criminal. He's numbered among the lawless. But of course, we want to keep in mind that the nature of his criminality, right, that it was not a criminality secured through actual just means. I think rather we can say here through something more like mob rule, is what it's to me if we look at the scenes. We then get verse 34, and if you'll notice probably in your Bibles, it's in brackets, and that's because it's contested in terms of how many times it shows up in actual manuscripts, but I'll come back to that in a second. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. So there's two elements, obviously, here in this one verse. It's the first portion that's the contested portion. This constitutes effectively the first saying of Jesus, of the three sayings that we get. And even though it's contested, I think it resonates deeply with Jesus's teachings. And I don't think there's any reason for us to ignore it. Or to see it as somehow an imposition. I don't know how we can explain, why it shows up in some manuscripts and others. I'm not enough of an expert of that to be able to say that. But one of the things that is clear as we move through Luke's telling of the story, and the thing that Luke himself seems to be especially interested in emphasizing, is Jesus's concentration to see this thing through to the end. Right? We don't get the same breakdown that we get, I would say, in something like the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus's humanity seems like it's a little bit more on display. His struggle with whether, to go through with this, his cry of dereliction from the cross, those things do not show up in Luke. What Luke is, I think, more interested in emphasizing, and it's not, these things I think can both be true and are both true, I would suggest. Because I think we want to take all these different views and kind of combine them. But Luke's particular perspective is especially to emphasize his singular focus on being faithful to Yahweh. Well, what is more faithful to Yahweh than to extend forgiveness? All right. I mean, Jesus himself has made this clear to his disciples that you must extend forgiveness, that's one of the marks of what it means to be a leader. So it makes a lot of sense that this is something that we would hear. It also, of course, resonates with Acts. In Acts, we're going to hear that the people put Jesus to death, quote unquote, out of ignorance, right? And so here you have a textual basis for that. The second thing, of course, that we get in this verse, and they cast lots to divide his clothing. This certainly has resonance in the Psalms. I think it's Psalm 22. I didn't get a chance to look this up, but what I think is important here is to think about the process of derobing Jesus in the context of crucifixion, right? Clothing was more than just something that you wore for utilitarian reasons to keep you warm and covered. It also typically signified something about you. You know, it said that you belonged to a certain people. Typically, your clothes were probably made by people that you knew, maybe even people in your family. And so to have your clothing stripped from you, it didn't just make you nude, it made you naked. And so it was meant to shame you. And this is part of that process of dehumanizing Jesus and recognizing that his death is near, right? And so, as I mentioned here, there's a clear reference to Psalm 22. So there's a textual basis for this and a kind of prophetic sensibility, but it's also simply a part of the process of crucifixion that we mentioned before. All right, then in verse 35, it's very interesting here, right? The people stood by, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, he saved others, let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. All right, so that wall that we talked about before that sort of had blurred is starting to be reformed in Luke's account, even here, where the people, they become bystanders, and I think that's problematic. If we think about this as people who live after the Holocaust, we use the language of being a bystander, and it's not necessarily a positive thing. So it doesn't necessarily render them positively, but they are not actively engaged in the mockery. The leadership and the soldiers are actively engaged. And of course, they represent then the two centers of energy that have been pushing this all along the way, right? The religious elite in collusion with Rome. All right, and then verse 38, we get the notice about the placard. There was an inscription over him, this is the King of the Jews. So this is something also that shows up in the Gospels. I think the Gospel of John gives us the kind of longest explanation for why Pilate did this, or at least gives us some sense about his motives, tells us that it's written in 3 different languages, etc. None of that is here. Luke doesn't really tell us why this is here, doesn't give us a lot of reason for it, other than it becomes, I think, again, a kind of echo of the kingship question. What does it mean to be king? What is the king that the people, and particularly the leadership, were expecting? And what is the nature of Jesus's own kingship? Right? Those are all live questions. And historically speaking, at the very least, this is another expression of why the Romans kept crucifixion as an instrument of I can't say justice, but of law. Well, they did that precisely to deter other people from rising up against them. So you put that placard over Jesus, and what does it say to everyone who sees it? This is what happens to you when you say you're the King of the Jews, right? You get crucified. And so I think that's another explanation that we can kind of bring in along with the others that we've already mentioned. All right. We then shift, right? So Jesus has been crucified. The public mockery continues. And now we get, though, the scene tightens, the aperture, the camera tightens away from the crowd onto Jesus himself and the 2 other victims who are experiencing crucifixion alongside him. Starting in verse 39, then, one of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." So the first of our 2 criminals, to me, this is a pretty amazing scene, because the whole of the Gospel of Luke and really all the Gospels, all of them one of the things that they carry in their sort of DNA is, what are you going to do with Jesus? I mean, the question is constantly put to the reader or the hearer. It's not just that you and I read the text, it's that the text reads us, right? There's an interchange that's happening. And the question is constantly, how are you going to respond? And so now, if we haven't gotten it, if we've missed it all along the way, now it becomes clear. Here are two people in the very same situation who respond very differently to Jesus, right? That's kind of the, sort of in a broad brush sense. And then there's some other, I think, more specific things that we can also say. So when I think about this first criminal, I tend to think about him sympathetically, frankly, as opposed to sort of dismissing. And I think he's covered by what Jesus says in his first saying, right? Which is, forgive them for they know not what they do. Even this man does not know what he's saying. And so, as I say here, he succumbs to the material reality of the power of death and essentially agrees, right, with what he's hearing. He probably knows nothing about the trial of Jesus, but he's heard what people are saying. And so here in his last gasp, this is his response, unfortunately. But then there's the other figure, the other criminal, also a criminal. So starting in verse 40 up to 42, but the other rebuked him, saying, do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. So here, the fourth time, right, the innocence of Jesus is proclaimed by someone on the cross. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. So our second criminal then adds his witness to Pilate, as well as the Gentile soldier in just a few minutes that we're going to hear from, proclaiming that Jesus is innocent, right? So there's a sort of confirmation now. And I wish I should have checked, but it would be interesting to see how many witnesses does it take to acquit someone. And I wonder if we've hit that number yet or not. Again, the second thing that I think is worth noting here, right, and it just kind of, we set up that scene of responding to Jesus. One of the things that this scene tells us is that it's never too late. It's never too late to turn to Jesus. And of course, also encoded in that is, today is the day to turn. Now is the time, right? Which is what we've also heard throughout the Gospels. So here is someone in a dire condition. And I think this is also the last thing that I will say here, is that this is a scene where Jesus is consistent. He's consistently Jesus, because here he is dying on a cross, and someone turns to him and they seek something from him, and he gives it to them. I'm sorry. It just kind of struck me how powerful it is. And this is what I meant when I said earlier that what the Gospels are concerned with is not so much, the gory details of his death, but the consistency of his life. Here he is at the very end, being Jesus. That's what makes him who he is. So you got to cut out all the crying stuff when you finish.
We're all crying.
Try and
Christian.
edit it for me. So again, right, here is a person, and here's just a couple, these are a couple of literary components. One is this person turns and talks to Jesus And I don't think it's not really there in the grammar, but the couple of the commentators made these suggestive comments that this person addresses Jesus as if he were king. And when you come into your kingdom, right, which is very much resonant, not precise, but resonant with the kingship parable that we didn't actually deal with this. We had to skip over it. But if you go back to Luke 19, the question, right, is the guy that goes into the far country to secure his kingship, will he come back and become king when he comes into his kingdom, quote unquote? So you're reminded of that scene. You're reminded of this whole question about kingship here. And again, like I already said, right? No matter what the context, discipleship is possible. I suppose these things are kind of secondary, really, to the consistency. Well, what we get in verse 43, he replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." This is the second saying of Jesus. It's very interesting. Pretty much as we move through the trial scenes, Jesus has either answered indirectly or not answered his accusers. And I think I mentioned before that I think the reason that happens is because he doesn't want to legitimate what's happening to him. He's going to go through it, but he's not going to honor it in that way. He's not going to offer it legitimation. Well, now we get an answer, right? Someone turns to him, and he turns and offers them, right? He says something back to them. Now, what does he mean exactly? That's been a big question. So the meaning of this saying is somewhat obscure, and there have been different approaches to this. And so I'll just kind of list out a few of these. I think one of the most popular ones is that this is read as Jesus saying, immediately after you die, you're going to be with me in heaven. And so that's certainly an option that's been put out there before. For others, it is it somehow resonates with the scene of the suffering king, that the king, right, that what Jesus is undergoing as in through the trial of crucifixion, as the suffering servant and as the king, that this man is getting a chance to experience this alongside of him. I probably should have gone into that a little bit more detail, but the third one, the one that I think has a lot. Am I frozen, or are you guys still with me? Okay,
Yep,
okay. I
we're
can see
here.
Linda. The third one is that perhaps this refers to resurrection, and in particular, resurrection of Jesus, right? That this is what's impending. So, whatever you choose of those, and maybe there's more as well. It's the idea that right now, it's that sense of today, right, which we've encountered in other places in the Gospels. Today is the day of salvation. Today is the day to turn. Now is the time, etc. To me, that seems to be, right, here's a person turning to Jesus, and now, this very day, they are going to experience a newness of life, whatever that might mean, right? Does that, exactly what that is again an open question. So, in other words, the discipleship element here, I think, is pretty significant. Okay, let me stop there and see what kind of comments folks might have. I won't take too long for comments, questions, because we have more material and only about 15 or so minutes left. Anybody burning to say or offer their thoughts here? Okay, I'll move us forward then. If that's, I will read the room, and we'll move forward here. Can I get a volunteer who's willing to read our next set of verses?
I'll do it. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. And when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly, this man was innocent." When all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all of his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things.
All right. So we find ourselves at the sort of ending scene of Jesus's trial, basically. And just before it ends, heaven and earth chime in as witnesses, essentially. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. The first thing I just want to note, excuse me, and I've used this before, I've mentioned before that all of the Gospels, including John, view the trial that Jesus experiences, essentially. And by trial, I don't just mean his going before Pilate, I mean the whole thing, his crucifixion, etc., as an apocalyptic trial. And apocalypse is a word that refers, of course, to the end. It refers also to divine judgment. We just mentioned a few minutes ago at the very beginning, the Son of Man, right, who's supposed to appear, and with his appearing is God's judgment. In this case, of course, the judgment is not meted out so much as Jesus takes it upon himself. And so the hour, right, the moment that Jesus has spoken of in the past has come, right? It's reaching its completion. It's reaching its crescendo. The idea of the sun being blotted out, right? Darkness. I think in Matthew's gospel or Mark, we hear about an earthquake. All of these elements are depicted in Amos as key elements of the quote unquote day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord is just shorthand for the day of apocalypse. And so that's essentially what's happening here. In addition, of course, to the notion that creation itself chimes in on the injustice, right? That there's a sense in which heaven and earth is mourning for what's being done to Jesus. If we take seriously the apocalyptic element, then what it leads us to, I think, is the very important point, which is that what is happening here in the life of Jesus is consequent for everyone, right? It's decisive for the cosmos, because that's what an apocalypse is. You know, apocalypse means the end of all things, essentially, or the judgment, tribulation, etc. And so there is this sense that the gospel authors had, and the early Christian community had. And remember, I mentioned before, the resurrection of Jesus raises the question, why on earth did Jesus have to die? Like, what was going on in that death? Why was this happening? And so searching the scriptures to understand that, of course, leads them in different kinds of directions. And one of the answers that comes away with is that somehow his death shifts things between God and humanity, right? It's this idea that we utilize oftentimes, right, of bearing our sin and bearing it away. That in a way, Jesus undergoes God's judgment on our behalf. That's kind of the idea. And so this apocalyptic imagery and these elements that happen, they evoke that sensibility. The tearing of the curtain, which is also attested in a number of other gospels, has been interpreted in different kinds of ways. And so I'm going to just offer to you a few of those. The probably the most problematic one, or at least the one that in the history of Christianity has caused the most problems because of the anti-Semitic, the ways that it has sort of fueled anti-Semitism, is that this is somehow a emblem of the ending of the law. I personally find this one also problematic because if we just keep reading through the book of Acts, we see all these Jewish Christians still keeping kosher. And so the argument is like, how do we include Gentiles without making them have to keep kosher, not whether or not we're going to end the law or not. And so I think if you do approach it in that way, you have to be very, very careful in the way that you do so, because it can lead to pretty negative, I think, repercussions and sort of cash out. The second interpretation that's been offered is that this was a sign of the impending judgment on the temple itself, right? So remember, around the time that Jesus dies, probably about 20 or so, maybe a little bit further years into the future, Jerusalem is sacked and the temple is destroyed. Now, by the time that Luke compiles his gospel, more than likely that event has already happened. So this, though, is one of the questions, like, is this foreshadowing that destruction? And that has been argued by some scholars. The next two, though, I think are probably ones that sort of also have resonance with other portions of the New Testament. And I think, to me, the third one is the one that I think kind of makes the most sense in a way. And you find this imagery used in the book of Hebrews, which is this idea that the temple, the veil, that curtain, was a curtain that cordoned off the Holy of Holies from the holy place. And the only person that could enter the Holy of Holies was the chief priest, and they could only do it once a year. And there were all kinds of like parameters put around that. And so the idea with the book of Hebrews is that Jesus, in the offering of his life, has actually opened up the way to God in a fundamental way that cannot be reversed. And so the rending of the veil signifies that opening, in terms of humanity and God, certainly the people and God. The last one that I thought was kind of interesting that I had not heard before, but that I sort of discovered as I was, doing work for this presentation, is the notion that this is a symbol for the removal of the barrier between Jew and Gentile. And the argument here is that this comes especially out of the book of Ephesians, which talks about tearing down the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile to create a new people, etc. So these are different options. I was reminded today that I had a colleague at one point when I worked at Bethel who wrote an entire book just on the rending of the veil and what it meant. And so I think there's probably lots and lots of other options and ways of interpreting this. But we then get, though, the last saying of Jesus in verse 46. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. As we mentioned before, just like the actual act of crucifixion, Jesus's death is not described in gory detail or in any sense of elaborate. He just breathes his last, and that's it. One of the things here, that this text, actually, this quote comes out of Psalm 31 from verse 5. But as I mentioned, and I say here in contrast and complement to Mark, it's very much in it resonates with Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 contains the verse, my God, why have you forsaken me? So if you read through Psalm 22, the first half of that psalm in particular, the first, maybe it's even 2/3 of that psalm, focus on the sense of abandonment, the sense of aloneness. But then that psalm ends with a sense that God is going to vindicate the person who's crying out. And I think it'd be fair to say that for Luke, at least, it is the emphasis on Jesus's confidence that God is going to vindicate him somehow. And so that's sort of the what we hear, rather than the my God, why have you forsaken me? We hear this other one. So it's Jesus's intentionality to remain faithful to Yahweh, which is central to Luke's telling of the story. And I think we can see this as a complement to how Mark tells the story. The last thing that I mention here is the giving up of the Spirit that Jesus talks about, right? Or that we hear in the verse, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. I think that this evokes, or it kind of intones what we hear about in 1 Corinthians 15, which is this idea that Jesus has become a life-giving spirit, right? He gives up his spirit in order that his spirit might be given away to others. And that certainly is the way that Paul, and it seems to me also the book of Acts, talks about the outpouring of the Spirit, that it's the Spirit of Jesus that's being poured out. It's the Spirit of Jesus that's being shared. And so here is sort of this moment in the text that picks up on that. Then we have verse 47. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, certainly this man was innocent. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that it cracks. So if we thought that the council was completely all agreed on killing Jesus, and we thought that the soldiers were all together in mocking him, we're going to find out as we move through the story that it's not homogeneous. And so here is the first place where we see that where a soldier, right, does not mock Jesus, but rather winds up intoning or becoming a witness to Jesus as an innocent person. Now, the Greek phrasing here, and there actually are some translations that will say, surely this man was righteous. And I think, from my perspective, righteous can also mean faithful. And if Luke's overarching concern in his telling of this particular portion of the story is the faithfulness of Jesus, his commitment to seeing this through, remaining faithful to Yahweh, then that would make a lot of sense. It's not, gospel or anything necessarily. You have to accept that, but it's important. Well, what does it ultimately mean? It means that a Gentile here is offering a witness to God, liberating, right? God's act of liberation. And the reason that I include this is because this was also an expectation of what would happen at the end, that the Gentiles themselves would see and be amazed, that they would confirm, right, that Yahweh, that there is indeed a God in Israel. And that this God overcomes the powers and principalities, et cetera, et cetera. And so here is that scene of a Gentile. It also, of course, is the fifth time. If we didn't hear it before, it's the fifth time that someone says Jesus is innocent. So if we from the beginning to end, we should come away with the sense that this is completely unjust and uncalled for, and undeserved in terms of his death. All right. Last couple of comments here. Let's see here. We're doing okay on time, sort of. And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. So just a couple of comments here. One is there's a kind of rehabilitation of the crowd already starting, right? That they go away from the scene in what I think we can read as a kind of response of remorse. They're beating their breasts over this, and that's a sign that certainly is a description of people who think that what has happened here is wrong, and their involvement in it essentially is wrong. That rehabilitation, of course, prepares us for what we experience as we move into the book of Acts, which is that the people do respond positively in many cases to the early Christians. It's typically the leadership that does not respond positively. And of course, that's in keeping with the basic pattern that we've seen throughout much of the Gospels. One of the things that I thought was very interesting, and I don't really know yet what to do with this, but this little phrase here in verse 49, but all his acquaintances stood at a distance. I'll come back to the women in just a second because I think that's very important. When I usually talk about the crucifixion, I will typically say something like Jesus is completely abandoned. But the way that Luke tells the story, and actually John's gospel includes, the disciple John at the scene, that's not entirely the case, right? They're there, they're present. Now they're at a distance, right? They're not close by, so they're just, we get a sense of their despondency, but they are there, they are present watching this unfold. And maybe even, who knows, maybe even Peter is watching this. But I just was struck by that detail that I had not picked up on once before. The last thing, though, is the women. And I think this is very important, the way that it's phrased here, including the women who had followed him from Galilee. I would suggest, I've been kind of reflecting on this a little bit over the last week or so as I've kind of been, prepping and doing this work, that it would not surprise me if the sources that Luke drew from, along, of course, with the Gospel of Mark, if it was made up mostly of women, right? Women become the connective tissue in Luke's telling of the story. Right here, we hear about the women who have been with Jesus since he came from Galilee, right? That means they are there at the beginning of his ministry, all along the way. And now they're sitting here at the crucifixion. And what we're going to hear, of course, is that they go to the tomb, watch his body get laid in the tomb. And of course, they're the first witnesses to resurrection. They become, I think, in a sense, the connective tissue that holds together this story. It's their memory, it's their vision, it's their having seen this. That's very, very important. And I think that's really worth underlining, especially in a world that still questions whether women should be ministers or not. But I think very significant. Okay. 8:04. How's everybody doing? I think there's one more page I'd like to do if everybody's okay with that. And then we can stop. So I'm not going to do another passage. I'm just going to do kind of this concluding page.
You're freezing up, Christian. Can you hear us?
I think we wanted to continue, and I'm not sure Comcast does.
Could be.
Well, their leaders don't.
See if he comes back.
Am I frozen?
Yeah, you
Now
are
you're
freezing up. Okay.
Am I unfrozen? Frozen?
Yes.
Unfrozen? Okay. Everybody literally, froze, and I was like, "Oh, that's got to be me." What I was going to say is that, and I mentioned before cross and resurrection as central to the telling of the story of Jesus, these have also been, central sites of reflection for the Christian faith, right? Thinking through, thinking with, thinking about, allowing it to make its way. And so any of the stuff that I offer here about the cross is just a small taste. It's just a couple of things that there's so much more that you can do. So this is not meant to be comprehensive in any sense. So why specifically the cross? And I just want to highlight, as I mentioned, I've got like kind of 4 things that are sort of somewhat interconnected. The first is what I would say is here's the theological point. God's willingness to enter into the most God-forsaken of spaces. Crucifixion was considered completely vile. I mean, there are Roman authors like Seneca and Cicero who write about crucifixion, who talk about civilized people should not use it. Now, in the same breath, then they offer a justification for why the Romans should keep it, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But the most wretched of deaths, this is a phrase that we take out of Josephus in his description of what crucifixion was. And you typically died from asphyxiation because the body was hung essentially, and it put pressure on the heart and the lungs. And that was typically how you die. You essentially were strangled to death. In Jesus's case, it was probably perhaps a mixture of asphyxiation and blood loss that actually leads to his actual death. But what does it mean? It really means humans destroying other humans. That's what crucifixion means. And it is an absolute exposure to, and really in some sense the real power of sin. So it's radical weakness, it's radical powerlessness, it's a complete exposure to death. God enters into this, right? And in this, and entering into it, what do we see? We see that God's weakness is greater than our strength. That's what we find, at least from the perspective of the resurrection. That God undergoes not just death, but death on the cross, which is indeed another set of kind of phrasing that we take from the ancient church. The second thing is the total rejection of Jesus, right? It's not just that he's found to be a ne'er-do-well, right? And as I mentioned here, an evildoer, a threat. It's that he's such a threat that he shouldn't even be given a dignified death, right? Because the law did allow for execution. If you wanted to kill Jesus because he was a blasphemer, you had basis in the law, and the way that you would have killed him was stoning him to death. But that's not what happens, right? And so handing him over in this way is a kind of fundamental repudiation of Jesus and of what he stood for, effectively. He receives a death that, in a sense, isn't just killing him, but it's literally trying to destroy his identity, to place him outside of the bounds of what it means to be human. And we have, of course, this language in the Old Testament that also talks about this accursed death, right? Cursed is anyone who's hung on a tree. And that obviously also is applied here. So the handing over to the Gentiles, I think, is a kind of emblem of the complete rejection. And of course, then more writ large, it's our rejection of God. Human beings, not just Israel, but human beings in general. We are caught up in this. We would much prefer our own way to God's way, and and therefore we are implicated. We're like Barabbas, right? That's why that winds up getting read into that scene. At the same time, I think it's important to note, of course, the background theme of kingship, right? Kingship is at play here, and part of the drama of the gospel is the contest between the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of this world, or the kingdoms of other spiritual powers, however we want to talk about it. And the cross is and was almost exclusively used to make a political point. And so stoning certainly could have a political, encoding in it, but it was not as clearly political as something like crucifixion, right? I mentioned this before, but crucifixion, the last step was when you hung the person on the wood. It included all these other pieces that basically meant and implied that the community as a whole was going to be involved in this, because people were going to jeer at this person, throw things at them, mock them, hit them, beat them, be involved in all that process. And in so doing, they were sort of signing off on the idea that whoever the victim was, they were not a part of this body politic. They did not belong here. They belonged outside. And therefore, we're going to treat them basically like an animal, effectively, is what happens. So what does that mean, theologically speaking? And here I'm just channeling the book of Colossians, that the cross is or was essentially the most lethal weapon of the powers and principalities. And the beauty of Colossians is it says that God disarms the powers and principalities through the cross. But that politics, that political element there, and what I mean by that especially is this vying between the kingdom of God, the reign of God, and these other ways of being human, these other ways of reigning, which we might call, kingdoms of this world. And of course, Jesus is executed with a placard hanging over him, right? It says this is the King of the Jews. Lastly, though, and this is, I think, the most paradoxical, and is I'm really kind of here trying to channel Paul in the beginning of 1 Corinthians, particularly chapter 2, which is that it is by the cross, it's in the cross, and essentially, and in the event of the cross, that we see God most clearly, and in particular, God's kingdom, God's reign. That we are shown a picture of what it means for God to rule, because in the cross, God is overcoming, not simply dying, not simply a passive victim, but also actively overcoming the powers and principalities. There's a famous John Owen, the famous Puritan divine, has this phrasing, and I think he even has a book, the title of which resonates with this, but it's this idea that by death itself is destroyed. And I think the title actually of the book is The Death of Death. Right? So it's this notion that evil ultimately collapses in on itself. That death attempts to kill, and in killing kills itself. Why? Because it shows that its power is not unending. Why? Because Jesus lives. Right? That's the perspective of all these documents, that Jesus is alive. So this is the means by which God's rule, God's reign really is made manifest. And God's love, as I mentioned here, in some sense, in the phrasing here, God's love is indeed stronger than death. And then we can kind of bring in, right? And here I'm kind of bringing in especially some phrasing from the Gospel of John, right? That Jesus is lifted up. This is the way the Gospel of John talks about this. And that in being lifted up, all people are drawn and right, being lifted up, and being lifted up it has a double meaning. Number one, it's a way of talking about enthroning a king. I mean, it's a classic utterance of that. But then obviously number two, it means being put on a cross. And so the cross, which was supposed to be a means by which Jesus is completely divested of being human and certainly being a king, in fact becomes the place and the site where God shows that God overcomes all things. And then and of course, again, lastly, this notion here of the coordination of Jesus's royal elevation and his debasement, and as I mentioned there, especially in the Gospel of John. So that's kind of that same point. I suppose it should be a subsidiary, but all right, that's it for tonight. I'm gonna start crying if we keep going any further.